South China Morning Post, 26th of May 2023, China asserts that Asians should reject NATO and settle their differences by Chinese law. When Asian countries needed protection from the big bully, China enslaved nations throughout Asia and conducted an all-out war against the Indian subcontinent. They don't require the Western military alliance, which will serve as a cover for the US's waning hegemony and ignite the region's tensions. Let's get right to it. The United States may wish to maintain a military presence in Asia as a check on a rising China, but they don't want a Cold War, God forbid, a hot war in their neighborhood. They may enjoy the U.S. 7th Fleet's presence, but it's unlikely that they would welcome the Anglo-American AUKUS alliance's proposed nuclear submarines to patrol their waters. The two European superpowers, Germany and France, would instead trade butter than bullets with China, and they had no intention of increasing their commitment to NATO at a time when they had been putting off meeting military spending objectives for years before the conflict in Ukraine. Nobody with common sense would wish to make the region that powers the 21st century's economy into a nuclear warhead like Europe did in the previous century. Most Europeans at least still know what the alliance's initials, which don't include Pacific or Asia, stand for. The Great Game ended for Britain almost three-quarters of a century ago, despite the country's leaders' penchant for lofty rhetoric. That's not my viewpoint, I'm quoting Simon MacDonald, a former senior diplomat for the British government, from an interview with the journal New Statesman. The useless G7 is attempting in vain to deflect attention from its shortcomings by blaming the powerful bully China, who therefore desires an Asian NATO. China not. The only remaining parties are the highest brass of NATO, including Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, who are unavoidably American clones and frequently more gung-ho than the typical Pentagon general, and of course, the US and its allies. Stoltenberg has criticized Beijing over Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea in addition to the conflict in Ukraine. Is Stoltenberg now free to explore the entire globe? He was already indicating a mission creep towards Asia-Pacific, or, if you prefer the US-NATO language, Indo-Pacific, well before his formal visit to South Korea and Japan in late January. Except that its expansion in Central Europe contributed to the Ukraine conflict. Presence in Asia will be considerably more offensive to a hegemonic China. Perhaps NATO produces obsessives about Asia. Ivo H. Dalder, a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, and Anders Fogh Rasmussen, Stoltenberg's predecessor, have jointly suggested an economic NATO based on Article 5 of the alliance's constitution. Understand what that means? Also, I'm not sure. The central concept is that a non-NATO, non-democratic nation, read, hegemonic China, that would have a disagreement with a NATO member state and take punitive economic action against it would be regarded as being economically hostile to all other member nations, hence, the reference to Article 5. This is appropriate because it is intended to combat economic coercion from China. But what about US sanctions, which now affect about one-third of all nations worldwide? The fact that it is not economic coercion makes them okay. Have you got it? The two bluntly stated, it's time to tell the Chinese bullies that if they poke one of us in the eye, we'll all poke back. A NATO office in Japan might complicate relations with China further. This is stated in their text, I'm not making anything up. You can read their note here, but spending time walking your dog outside on a nice day would be better. You can also use the papers it is printed on to clean up after your dog. Whatever you name it, Asian NATO, an extended NATO, or Asian alliances with NATO, in the end, it's all just a front for the US military, which will carry out all the complicated work. So what's the point of NATO? So why the alphabet soup with the Quad, AUKUS, and other things? It covers the struggle against a hegemonic China to keep its dominant position in the region and the arrogance of the smaller former colonial nations. China claims that Asia has every justification to oppose becoming the scene of another East-West conflict. Taking ASEAN and China's South China Sea Code of Conduct seriously is an excellent place to start. Chinese had already drawn the 9-dash line. There will be less justification for the West intervening if China is destroyed and Asian countries can contain or even settle their issues.